Okay, we're gonna get started here since it looks like more people are logged on. Um, so first of all, I just want to thank you all for joining us here today. I'm Katie Marchini, and I'm the COO here at Replate. We're a food rescue organization based out of the San Francisco Bay Area, but we work all throughout California and across the US. And we're super excited to be here to talk about SB 1383 today. It's a really large piece of legislation, but we're only going to be focused on the edible food recovery portion. So that is the portion of the legislation that requires food generators to donate their surplus food. And this is in efforts to reduce the amount of edible food in landfill, which will in turn reduce the amount of methane that is released into the environment. And so this is our second webinar in a three-part series. So our first one was a couple months ago, and we discussed SB 1383 more broadly. This one is geared towards food generators. And so we're going to talk today about compliance and what that means. And we'll have another one on August 18th. And we'll be sending out a link for that one if you want to register. That one is geared towards nonprofits. So please feel free to share that with your network if you have anyone that you think might be interested. So we will be recording this webinar today, and you can look at our social media. Our handle everywhere is at Replate Your Meal, and we will be posting that later this week. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. My team will be answering some of those questions in real time, and then some of the other questions we'll save towards the end, and we'll answer live with the panelists. If we don't get to your question, we will respond via email in the next week or so. So with that, we are a food recovery organization, and we have been around for about 6 years now. And so we were really excited when this legislation went into place because we think it's really important that more people engage in food recovery. And so our approach to food recovery has been a little bit different. So as a food recovery organization, we're picking up food from food generators. That could be anything from a hotel, a restaurant, a large venue, and we're dropping it off directly at a nonprofit organization that's doing the actual distribution. And that can really range as well. So it could be a food bank, a shelter, a soup kitchen. It could also be a smaller nonprofit that you might not think about, such as a job training program or a youth program. And so we make it really easy, not only for our food donors to sign up and schedule a pickup, but also for the nonprofits that we work with to sign up and let us know what type of food they need and how much they can receive and when they can receive it, so we can make the best match possible. And so our approach has been a little bit different in that, we do have a website where people can sign up and schedule. We have paid food rescuers. We're not a volunteer run organization. And, if you do sign up to work with us, you will be completely compliant for SB 1383. But regardless of whether you work with us or another food recovery organization, or you plan on self-hauling, our goal here today is really to have everyone feel comfortable with the SB 1383 legislation and understand what their role is in it, but also to really drive home the link between climate change and surplus food that's been wasted. Because we think that in order for this legislation to have the largest positive impact possible, people really need to understand why it was put into place and the positive benefits that it's going to have, not only for your business, but also for the environment and the social good that it can do as well. So without further ado, we will get into it. I'll go through kind of the run of show for today while introducing our panelists. So first we'll have Daniel Osborne, who's an environmental scientist at CalRecycle, give us a brief introduction to SB 1383. So that way we're all on the same footing about, as a food generator, who needs to comply and by when. And then we'll have a brief presentation by Bree Zen, who is Green Operations Specialist at SFO, and they're also a partner of ours. And she will give a presentation about how they've gone about implementing their food recovery program at SFO and the challenges that they faced and kind of where they're at in the implementation process right now. So really exciting to hear from a food generator. And then we'll move into the panel portion, which will also include James Bernard, who's the Senior Sustainability Consultant at Great Forest Sustainability Solutions, and Ned Spang, who's Associate Professor of Food Science and Technology at UC Davis. So without further delay, we will get into it, and I will pass it off to Danielle.
All right, thanks, Katie, and thanks for having me, or having me back, I should say. So this slide shows who is defined as a commercial edible food generator under SB 1383, and they're broken down into 2 tiers. So tier 1 generators are required to start donating this year, 2022, and that includes grocery stores, supermarkets, food service providers, food distributors, and wholesale food vendors. And note there are various thresholds for each of those categories. Tier 2 generators are then required to start donating in 2024. And this includes restaurants, hotels, health facilities, large venues and large events, local education agencies, and state agencies with cafeterias, and again, with specific thresholds. I wanted to give a little bit of context for why we broke it down into these 2 tiers. More of the tier 1 generators typically have some sort of food donation program already in place, so this should be more familiar for them. And they also typically have larger amounts of edible food that is easier to recover, such as fresh produce or packaged grocery items, compared to tier 2 generators that typically have more prepared foods. So this tiered approach helps give the tier 2 generators more time to prepare and establish effective food recovery programs. Next slide. So the timeline for rollout, as shown here, the regulations took effect at the start of this year, and that means that jurisdictions are required to adopt their enforceable ordinances or other enforceable mechanisms, and those tier 1 generators are required to start donating. January 1st, 2024, however, is when local enforcement begins, meaning that enforcement actions can be taken. So we want to clarify that these first 2 years are primarily focused on outreach and education of all stakeholders, food recovery services, generators, and jurisdictions. And then in 2025, this is our target year for certain goals for SB 1383. This, like Katie said, this is a small component of it, our edible food recovery part, but it is a methane emission reduction bill. And so the goal is to reduce our organic waste by 75% by 2025 and recover no less than 20% of edible food that is currently disposed, also by 2025 and annually thereafter. And with that, I will pass it back to Katie.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Danielle. And so everyone, if you have more detailed questions, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A because Danielle will be able to answer those for you. So now I'm going to hand it off to Bree from SFO.
Thanks, Katie. Okay. There we go. Thank you, Sarah, for putting that on. So hi, everyone. My name is Brona Zen, and I am the Environmental Operations Specialist at San Francisco International Airport. And I'm so incredibly jazzed to announce that SFO relaunched its food recovery program, SFO Unites Against Hunger, also known as UAH, on March 30th of this year. So UAH enables airport tenants, so any of the food vending businesses, retail shops, and restaurants, to donate unsold meals and snacks to support communities who need it most. And SFO's amazing partner and service provider in food recovery is, of course, Replate. And next slide. So on to the relaunch process. So we first had to identify 2 food donation hubs, which are physical rooms that airport tenants have access to drop off any and all of their surplus edible food. So the hubs contain commercial-sized refrigerators to preserve the integrity of the donated surplus and crates for tenants to store the surplus in. And then we also targeted food vending businesses within close proximity to the food donation hubs. And this was really to ease any of the hurdles for participation, because if they are a 2-minute walk away from the hub, it's a lot easier to onboard the tenant and for them to implement it within their daily operations. And of course, we are continuing to garner interest and participation from the business tenants. And another crucial piece of this were, of course, the security clearances and the permissions at, a high security place such as an international airport. So I've worked with the Security Access Office here at SFO to provide SFO badges for Replate's food rescuers, obtained parking permits so the Replate vans can access the courtyard for parking, and then also ensuring that airport commission staff and especially the security folks at SFO are aware of the food donation program. So when they, if they see someone going in and out of the food donation hubs, it doesn't cause alarm. And then another thing that I found incredibly helpful for the relaunch was providing a tour of the food donation hub to the store managers, staff, and the business tenants. So although this is a time-consuming process, because I am bringing each business tenant to the closest donation room, it really has allowed me to build relationships with them, thank them for their service, and share more about the environmental impact of their donations. And as mentioned earlier, we relaunched SFO Unites Against Hunger on March 30th, and then right before the relaunch, we also offered an orientation just to onboard the interested business tenants and give them a good overview of what the program is and how it operates. And we have a reoccurring cadence set up with Replate. So it's every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. And this is great because it has allowed the business tenants to get into a rhythm with the food donations. So they know it's like 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, when the pickups are occurring. And next slide. So as mentioned, SFO's amazing partner in making this program reality is food recovery service, Replate. So Replate has a fleet of food recovery vans and a team of food rescuers that collect unsold edible food donated by SFO's business tenants on a weekly basis. And the Replate then matches and transports all the donated food to communities experiencing food insecurity across the San Francisco Bay Area. And here's a photo of one of Replate's food rescuers, Matt, and he is currently in one of the food donation rooms at SFO. So the red crates that he has in front of him are currently filled with food, and the silver door that you see to the left-hand side is the industrial size refrigerators where business tenants can store their perishables in. And next slide. So right now, for our participating business tenants, for about the 2 months of relaunch, we currently have 37 businesses signed up out of the 97 or so food vendors at SFO, and that is a 38% enrollment rate as of May 2022. And it consists of 9 airport lounges, 15 restaurants, and 13 retail shops all across the airport. And next slide. And there is a wide variety of accepted foods. So we accept prepared foods such as pastries or cooked meals, and then packaged foods such as prepackaged wraps or sandwiches sold at a self-service kiosk, and then raw ingredients such as a head of lettuce or a bag of coffee beans. And for the prepackaged sandwiches, those are a very popular donation item from our retail shops. And in the middle photo, you see breakfast sandwiches and tomato chips. And the thing about those tomato chips, when I was discussing with the business tenant, they weren't even expiring anytime soon. That tenant had just purchased these tomato chips and they weren't a hot seller for them. So they took them all off the shelves and then donated them to SFO Unites Against Hunger. And then for the beverages on the right-hand side, so these beverages are perfectly fine. It's coconut water, regular water. And they just sustained some sort of cosmetic damage on the exterior. So the retail shops didn't want to put it out for sale anymore. So they donated those to the food recovery program. And next slide. And one of the really great things about Replate is that they provide us with this incredible data of the environmental impact of donations. So each food donation hub has a scale in it, and then each pickup is weighed and then translated into an environmental impact report. And food is incredibly resource intensive, requiring land, water, labor, time, and so many other resources to grow and transport it. And for example, it takes 1,800 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef. So every time a beef sandwich is thrown away, it means that all those embedded resources are also being thrown away too. And these are the metrics for the 2 weeks of relaunch. And we have about 1,500 pounds of recovered food, which translates into this estimated gallons of water saved, meals serviced, and pounds of carbon diverted. And if we use these metrics for a yearly projection, we have the potential to save 9,000 pounds of food. And next slide. And here are some of the nonprofit recipients of SFO's surplus edible foods. City Team and United Council of Human Services are nonprofits in San Francisco, and they set up grab and go food stations outside of their office. And lots of seniors, SRO residents, which are the single room occupancies in the city, folks experiencing homelessness and those in recovery from addiction are using their services. And next slide. So on to the next steps for expansion. So right now we have around 38% of food vending tenants at SFO enrolled to donate. And it's my goal in the next year and a half to get 100% of all food vending businesses to actively participate and also to recover the maximum amount of surplus food possible. And we are increasing business enrollment through the airport's Green Business Certification Program. And in order to obtain the certification, one of the action items is to donate surplus food. So I've really been leveraging that for all those business tenants that are wanting to get Green Business certified. And then SFO Sustainability has also worked out an amazing partnership with the property managers at the airport. So every time the property managers onboard a new business tenant, they also inform the business tenants about the food donation program. And we are also promoting tenant education. So the websites for SFO Unites Against Hunger are up, and I can place them in the chat after this presentation. And I'm also developing a fact sheet for UAH, which will be used as a guide for the business tenants. And I'm also working with the SFO IT folks to upload an environmental impact dashboard similar to the one that I showcased a couple slides above. And then I'm also working on internal employee engagement and education. I'm preparing a quarterly report for Airport Commission staff. And then I've also presented at various internal meetings such as Earth Week for SFO. And then also, working with the marketing folks at SFO to communicate the great initiatives by our amazing business tenants on SFO's social media pages. And hopefully all of these things combined and that, that outreach that we've been doing at SFO will get us to the 100% business enrollment by 2024. And next slide. And that's it. So here's my contact information. If you guys have any lingering questions on the SFO Unites Against Hunger, and I'll pass it back to Katie.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Bree. That was great. Getting started with a large company like SFO, working with multiple retail vendors can be really complicated logistically of getting everybody on board. And I feel like the outreach portion that you guys have all done is really important for making sure that people actually engage with the program. You have to know that it's actually exists to be a part of it. And I feel like so many times people have donation programs, but their employees don't know about it. And it's the person on the ground who is working with the food that is going to be the one who actually needs to do the donation, not someone higher up. And so it's really important that every individual is like engaged and knows that this program is in place. And I think you guys have done a really good job of doing that. Awesome. So we're going to move into the panel discussion portion. So I'm going to start off with Ned. I'm wondering if you can situate us a bit and tell us about the environmental impacts of food waste and why this legislation is important.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Katie. And I think Bree and Danielle did a nice job introducing some of the concepts here, the linkage between food waste and environmental impact. So as Danielle mentioned, one of the main goals of SB 1383 is to reduce short-lived climate pollutants. And what that means is really targeting methane reductions across multiple different industries and activities in the state, which includes organics, which includes food waste. So it's, we're in a portion of SB 1383 here. But the challenge with really organics diversion, or really the benefit, is that food waste is really sort of a triple climate threat, in my opinion. As Bree said, it takes a lot of resources to grow and produce the food that we eat. So you can think about the whole food supply chain going back to the farm. You have to harvest the crop, you have to store the crop, you have to package the crop, distribute the crop, and then basically keep it in refrigeration or other storage requirements along the whole way. That adds up in terms of energy costs. And whenever you have energy costs, you have carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas emission. Then it gets to the consumer, or it gets lost or wasted across the food supply chain. Wherever it gets diverted, if it goes into a landfill, that organic material actually breaks down and releases methane from a landfill. Now, methane is another greenhouse gas, and it's short-lived. It's in the atmosphere for about a decade, as compared to carbon dioxide, which can be in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. Even so, methane is about 28 to 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So that's why this bill is really focused on methane. It's a very potent greenhouse gas. So we do not want this food to end up in a landfill. It's really, there's no economic benefit to putting it in a landfill, and all we have are these methane emissions that are contributing to climate change. The third piece that affects climate is that if we take organic material and put it in a landfill, we're not using that organic material and returning the nutrients to the soil. And if we're not returning those nutrients to the soil, we rely on synthetic fertilizers, which also are energy intensive and release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So that's three pathways of increasing greenhouse gas emissions with one activity, which is diverting food waste from landfills. So this is a really, really important piece of legislation, and CalRecycle is doing a great job with the education portion of how to really meet this legislation with all the multiple stakeholders involved. It's going to require a lot of partnerships, as we've heard from SFO and Replate. That's just one example of many that's going to be required for this really massive transformation of how we deal with organics here in California.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I feel like most people don't realize, when you're throwing something in the trash or in the compost, you in that moment are not thinking about all the resources that went into making that food. And just, like Bree was saying, the number of gallons of water that goes into producing a pound of beef. And I feel like if people thought about that every time they throw away food, a lot less would be thrown away. Danielle, can you tell us a little bit about the waste characterization study that was done to benchmark this legislation?
Yeah, we had a 2018 waste characterization study that surveyed 128 samples of waste generated from 5 types of food generators across 4 regions of the state. So it was a statewide study. It took samples from supermarkets and grocery stores, food wholesalers, limited service restaurants, full service restaurants, warehouse clubs, and super centers. And it characterized that food that was found in those samples as potentially donatable, not donatable, or inedible. And it found that there was approximately 5.85 million tons of food being sent to landfills, and about 1.12 million tons of that, much more, was considered potentially donatable. So this, if you take the 20% goal, it's part of the legislation informed by this study, that comes out to 223,500 tons of food as a target for recovery, or about 372 million meals. And that's using a common factor of 1.2 pounds per meal, if anyone's interested. I also want to just note that we're currently carrying out another waste characterization study, and we're hoping that this will help build upon this data, and we're expected to publish the data on that in late summer or early fall.
Awesome. Thanks for that. So it seems like there's both, you guys are doing another waste characterization study, but it seems like this is why part of the reason why the reporting piece on the side of the food generators and the nonprofits is important, to be able to track how much food is actually being recovered throughout the state.
Absolutely. Yes, we want to set these targets and then be able to assess how effective we are at actually achieving those.
Yeah. Awesome. So this is for everyone. Just what are some of the unexpected benefits to having a food recovery program in place? And this could be from the business perspective or the environmental perspective.
I think 1383 really, the announcement of it in January really brought this to public attention. One of the general managers of one of our client office buildings emailed me and said, "Does this mean I'm going to have to refrigerate my compost?" Aha, okay, we've got you engaged. Now we're going to talk to you about having a reality check and getting into the flow of recovering food and redistributing unused materials.
Yeah, getting that conversation started.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Anything to add?
Hi, Katie. Yeah, I can jump in here. And I think one kind of unexpected benefit is the better inventory management and control because our business tenants can see how much food they're donating and the frequency of their donations within Replate's platform. Then it helps them optimize purchasing going forward. And this might reduce donations, but it is kind of the ultimate goal, which is food waste prevention. And then it also leads to huge cost savings for our tenants. And then another surprising thing that I noticed is that many business tenants that I've engaged with are incredibly happy that SFO reinstated the food recovery program, because when they are the store managers, they are the ones tallying those losses and reporting the volumes of food that their staff are essentially tossing out into the compost bin the moment it hits its sell by date, which isn't even really an expiration date or the best by date. And no one wants to actively participate in dumping out something that they know can be reused and repurposed and recovered. And it just really goes to show that if institutions provide the structural support and guidance and resources for businesses to donate and participate in environmental initiatives, they really are inclined to do so, and they'll actively participate. So yeah, I'm just really glad that the airport is doing this, and that so many of the business tenants have voluntarily participated and are actively using the resources provided to them.
That's such a good point about employee morale surrounding throwing away food. We've heard that from many different types of food generators. So we work with a lot of tech companies that are serving their employees meals, and oftentimes it's the office manager at the end of the day dealing with the surplus. And it's a bad feeling to throw out 50 pounds of food, especially if you're doing it on a daily basis. And not to mention, like, they also see how inefficient, the inventory is. If you're throwing out that much, something is wrong with the ordering aspect. And like, that's a clear, easy way for a company to be saving some money. Bree,
I have one additional piece to that, which I think that this will, over time, I think that the process will be easier because we'll start to design in the infrastructure and procedures for this. Like right now, when you have this transformational change, you're sort of retrofitting solutions on the systems, how you're used to behaving or how you're used to storing food even. Think of the next time you're working at the airport or they're redesigning a wing of the airport, they might build that cold storage room in knowing that they have to have space for donation, right? Rather than trying to find if there's cold storage space currently available. So I think that kind of thinking, what's sort of complicated or might feel a little difficult now, once we learn how to do this and we start designing for it, it should get easier and easier over time. And that'll just be a fantastic improvement. I think it will lead to increased levels of recovery over time as well.
That's such a good point.
we're really being offered an opportunity to characterize food waste as a whole ecosystem and to put people together in food chains, as it were, to recover food and to understand, as Ned was saying, the means of production and what it really means. But we're having a holistic experience here, and it's great to have an opportunity. The other thing is SB 1383 being a part of a national company and being partnered with Replate, another national company, is that 1383 is driving, as California invariably does, the agenda with other states and nationally. So we're going to be the test bed, as always, and how we do will be looked upon as other states come online with their own legislation.
Definitely. It's always exciting when California is the one leading the way. I also think it's just such a good shift in culture, in that, you know, so many people, we still hear to this day, we almost started working with a donor at the end of 2021. And, you know, they were super excited to work with us. And then they suddenly got blocked by legal. Legal said, well, we think this is too much of a liability. And this is a donor that's based in California. They decided to not go through with the donation. And they're like, well, little do you know, in 1 month, you are going to have to donate this food. It is legal. It has always been legal and safe to donate, but now you have to donate. And so I'm excited for kind of the narrative around food recovery to change as well, because I feel like for so long, so many food generators have not donated because they've been under the misconception that they couldn't. Which is interesting. Bree, I was going to ask you, do you have any advice for other food generators when they're going in to start implementing their food program, and maybe where they should start?
I think one thing for food generators is that you have to really make it as seamless as possible for the business tenants to donate. So it involves, you know, identifying what the barriers are and then pitching the program in a way that alleviates those challenges, and having a team that works with the business tenants to solve those challenges, and you know, strategizing to implement food donations within their day-to-day operations. And, you know, one way that I've done this is, you know, the tours that I provide to business tenants. So it is time consuming because I am meeting with the business tenant at their site and, you know, walking with them to the food donation hub and bringing them there. But it really allows me to, you know, build rapport with them, build a relationship, talk to them about the importance of the program. So, because not everyone, I realize not everyone has fully made that connection between food and the environmental impact. So if the airport is going to tell them to do something, I want them to know the why that they're doing it, and really just honing that in and thanking them for their service, and, you know, kind of like that morality aspect that you talked about, Katie, about, you know, boosting morale and, you know, really talking about the climate impacts and making sure that the tenants know why they are doing this, why they are taking that additional time out of their day to take the surplus to the physical food donation hub. And then another thing is, you know, I'm all about kind of material and structural support. So, you know, we have worked with my colleagues to kind of put a guideline for instructions to post at the back of house. So the kitchen staff and, you know, staff that work most intimately with the food are aware of the program. And then I'm also in the process of drafting a fact sheet for the business tenants, so they are aware of kind of the big picture idea of what the program is. And yeah, I'm just, you know, I'm just really convinced and hopeful that when given the structural support and when they feel supported, that people will do the right thing and they will actively donate, because that is all I've seen at the airport with kind of the increasing enrollment week by week and the, you know, pounds of donations that are coming in every single week.
Yeah, it seems like once people know that the program exists, understand why they're doing it, it's a pretty easy sell, because regardless of how you feel about climate change, I think most people really relate to the food insecurity piece, and knowing that that food is being eaten versus tossed is like a pretty easy thing to get behind. James, how does a food recovery program fit into a larger sustainability program for a company or a retailer?
Well, I'll speak from our perspective. Our clients are hotels, large office buildings, and tech campuses, and they're not required. They're all tier 2, not required and to comply until 2024. Hotels, it's really interesting because a natural operation in a hotel is recycling the food right into the employee cafeteria. Even when high-end desserts, for example, are created, a pastry shop within a hotel is cutting the corners off or the edges off of a sheet cake so that they look perfect. Well, what happens to those cuttings? And they become individual desserts in an employee cafeteria. Overproduction is always in a hotel because of banquets, weddings, memorials, what have you. Overabundance is something that clients actually seek. So it's a very difficult chain. Often with banquets, it's a different crew than culinary. So making the chain internal to a hotel, culinary to banquets to stewarding, is really important. For office buildings, there are two kinds of office buildings: the pretty much solely office buildings, and then the multi-tenant type buildings. For the office buildings, many of the high-end tenants have their own kitchens and cafeterias, and they're pretty good about not wasting food, but could do a lot better. The food service outlets have programs to mark down their food, mainly because they don't want to carry it out or dispose of it. So that's a real opportunity there to get them involved. And it would be on the order of what Bree showed, where there'd be a centralized hub in the building so that Replate could come in and pick it up without much struggle at all. Coffee bars, juice bars, some of Bree's signed up people are already on that list. Restaurants within an office building would be a slightly different task, but again, could utilize that centralized location. For tech campuses, one of our clients actually was a subscriber to the Lean Path program and was involved in culinary operations in terms of weighing all the waste and making sure that they had good numbers. But the problem there we found in auditing them was that a lot of their material was thrown away, even when it wasn't past pull date or even close to pull date, as Bree was pointing out. And those are, of course, artificial deadlines. But during COVID, when we did these audits, there was a lot of additional packaging. So you had to wonder what was going on. And it turns out that janitorial services who were not participating in Lean Path came in behind and simply cleaned up, and their instructions were different. So getting the facility manager and the janitorial and the culinary, again, that ecosystem concept, on board with each other and talking to each other is really important. And having, as Bree was pointing out, or Katie, I guess it was, at the end of the day, office manager serving as a focal point, as an organizer, also really important. But everybody's got to be in sync here. Great ideas from Bree in terms of having parking validated or pickup zones for Replate to come in downtown San Francisco, where a lot of our clients are. Really rigorous at certain times of the day, being smart about all this and understanding scheduling and what is normal and what would be outside of the normal would be really important. We've got time, but not as much time as people would want to believe. There's already a lot of grassroots stuff, but it's not formalized. And we want it to be formalized because then everybody will understand their roles and responsibilities, and I think be much more effectively situated to recover food. We've had a hard time getting people to compost all over the country. Now we're going to tell them that compost is a last resort. But I think if we do it right by basically using words like hunger and prevention of greenhouse gases such as methane, we'll have a better purchase on getting that message across than we ever did with composting.
Definitely. Yeah, it feels like it's easier to encourage people to do something when it's going to benefit someone directly, and they see the people, especially in California, right? We have a huge food insecurity problem and a huge houselessness problem. And so when you're seeing that on a daily basis and you know where your food is going, I think it helps encourage you to do the right thing versus composting. It's just like, I don't know, it's going to the soil. It's harder to feel empathy for the soil. Awesome. So we're going to move into some questions from the audience. So this one is directed at SFO, but I think Danielle, you might be the person to answer this. The question is, if your vendors choose not to donate food for SFOs, so if one of the retailers at SFO chooses not to donate the food, are you required to enforce this law to ensure food is donated?
So yes, they are required to donate. Tier 2 generators, remember their requirements to donate begin in 2024. And then this is really a jurisdiction level program when it's actually implemented by individual jurisdictions. So who is enforcing that can vary between those, but they do need to have an enforceable ordinance or other mechanism to ensure that those stakeholders are donating the maximum amount of their excess edible food.
Yeah, so it sounds like the county or the city is ultimately the one responsible for enforcement, depending on which jurisdiction you're in and what they're
Yeah, it can be, some examples we've heard, like county public health departments, or in some cases, contracting out with consultants to perform inspections.
Got it. Great. This next question is from Evelyn. It says, does SB 1383 provide or require support for food generators to learn how to reduce their food generation upstream, i.e. food waste prevention?
I'll also take that one. So yeah, but 1383 does not include any food waste prevention provisions. Something I do want to mention is that it does require education and outreach of generators, but specifically about the requirements of SB 1383. And then health inspections are also required. This is not part of 1383, but they're required to provide information about food donation as well. So it's a little bit different. Those are the two types of education components that are required to be given to generators, but source reduction, food waste prevention is not written into the legislation or regulations.
Yeah, not a piece of the legislation, but we at Replate definitely here for you if you're interested in that. I mean, for us, the most important thing when we're working with a food donor is to get them to be donating less food over time. We don't want to see donations increase. We want to see them decrease. And we're actually implementing a new piece of technology recently. So our food rescuers are now entering really detailed information about every pickup, which is going to allow us to show our donors what they're donating the most of on a monthly basis, so they can hopefully reduce their ordering. So for example, your rice, you're donating like 200 pounds of rice, and month over month, it's increasing. And so you might need to draw back on providing that. This next one is from Jordan, and I think Ned, you might be the best one to answer for this one. Has anyone looked at the trade-offs that perishable food recovery has due to increased refrigeration needs and HFC emissions from inefficient cold storage systems?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jordan, and you would fit right in with my research lab here on campus. We love to ask questions like this. I actually have not seen a study looking at this particular question, But for those of you out there listening, HFC, hydrofluorocarbon, is a refrigerant, and it's a chemical we use to actually go through the process of refrigerating. And if they're released to the atmosphere, it's not good for climate change. I think, this trade-off, it's going to be, this is a classic academic answer, by the way, it depends. What type of food are you saving? Is it meat or vegetables or bread? There's a different environmental footprint that you're comparing if you save that food. And then the level of leakiness of the refrigerated system is obviously going to influence the flow of HFCs. So it's good to ask this type of question. We want to think about, we're taking an action with a policy. What are the potential spillover effects? And so this is a classic example of trying to understand some of the spillover effects from an environmental impact perspective. So I don't have the answer for you, but I commend your question. This is the way we need to be thinking about some of these actions.
It's a great question. It's also something, as a food recovery organization, we talk about it often, of trying to make sure that we're making the best match possible, but also that it's close, because we don't want to be driving stuff all around. And it can be, I think it's going to be particularly difficult now with SB 1383, because there's going to be more food flowing into the charitable food system that, for example, the Central Valley might have a huge 40,000 pound donation of something that their food banks can't absorb, and then it needs to be brought elsewhere to be absorbed, and kind of figuring out, okay, what's the trade-off for that? Does it still make sense to recover it? What's the bottom line here? And I think hopefully some academics will be studying this in the near future, so we can have some answers rather than just going off of a gut feeling.
Well, yeah, and what I would say too is that's just the environmental comparison. Whereas if you have edible food that can be recovered to feed someone in need, I think that's the what we need to be thinking about with recovering edible food under this legislation.
Definitely, and that's something. Yeah, that's what it generally comes down to. Is well, there are people who can utilize it, and if there are people who can utilize it, then we'll get it somewhere.
And I just wanted to add one thing to that, Katie, since you mentioned, sometimes these recovery efforts will span counties, or that food needs to go somewhere else that does have capacity. And I didn't touch on it in my brief overview of the regulations, but it does include capacity planning. So jurisdictions do need to be assessing how much edible food is currently landfilled by the generators in their jurisdiction, and then what capacity their food recovery organizations have to actually recover and accept that food. And then if they, calculate a discrepancy there, then they need to plan to increase that capacity too. So the focus on local solutions is really what we're aiming for here.
Yeah, makes sense. So we have another question here. It says, lots of challenges have been mentioned, but in general, what are some of the biggest gaps in achieving the next steps towards reducing food waste? I have an answer right off the bat, which I would say date labeling. I think we need comprehensive legislation about date labeling, because a lot of food gets wasted at the consumer level and also at the retail level, because people look at a best by date and think that that means that it's expired. I always say, like, Dana Gunders, who's the ED at ReFed, once said, like, a can of beans doesn't know that it's turned midnight and suddenly it's supposed to be expired. And I think it's really hard. As a consumer, you learn to trust the warning labels on things. And so if we're putting dates on there and they don't really mean anything, it can be really difficult to have a behavior change without having the supporting change of, like, okay, this has a date that actually means something. But would love to hear from the rest of you.
Well, I think the human challenge is probably the biggest one in terms of, again, that ecosystem, having people being able to talk to each other and not bump into each other I think there's a role for technology to understand when things settle down a little bit, not right now, but when things settle down in terms of who is on the playing field, figuring out who is best situated to serve a particular need or a particular donor. And one of the hallmarks of what I'm seeing in our food recovery community as it builds is that people are very interested in not competing and delivering where it's most needed.
Definitely. Did anyone else have anything about what the next steps are to reducing food waste?
Yeah, I have one more just sort of broad recommendation I think I
Yeah.
always try to provide, which is I think there's a lot more room in K through 12 education about food systems and dealing with food waste, circular food economy. All of these things I think are so important that they should be taught to people all across their whole lives. And then they enter whatever career they're doing, whatever they're studying, and they bring that perspective to the decisions they're making. And I said before, part of this is going to be designing infrastructure, part of it's going to be identifying partnerships. We just need to think about how we're dealing with food, and we've been throwing it out for too easily for way too long. And so I think that what the legislation is trying to change. And I think over the long run, having that education, we'll get better and better at this, and we won't even need these laws in the future. It's just the way we will do business with our food system.
Oh, yeah, I really hope that that's the case. I think it's really exciting that at least in K through 12 right now, you're seeing more and more share tables. So that's tables where kids can put food that they haven't eaten for somebody else to take. And it's really exciting to see that, because that's something, 5-10 years ago would be really frowned upon. And finally, we're moving towards like, it's untouched. Of course it can be eaten, and using more common sense when it comes to these things. But I think if I had learned more about this as a child, I wouldn't have thought for so long that, it was told to me at a very young age that food donation was illegal. And so you just kind of, if an adult tells you something, you just kind of believe it at a certain point in your childhood, and you go on continuing to believe that. And yeah, I think being able to educate children to not only understand like these are the things that we do as a society, but here is why we do them, is really effective to getting behavior change down the road. Awesome. Well, if it doesn't look like we have any other questions from the audience, one other question that I wanted to pose to you all is just, what are some of the biggest challenges do you think for food generators to become compliant with SB 1383? And what you're hearing from Bree, either from retailers of what some like a hoop might be for them to jump through that they feel nervous about, or whatever it may be.
I think one challenge is probably the proximity, because currently there are 3 kind of accessible food donation hubs at the airport, but they're all kind of centered around terminals 2, the international terminals. So that leaves kind of a further distance for those in Terminal 1 and Terminal 2. So right now, Terminal 1 is getting a build out. So kind of as Ned had briefly mentioned, kind of incorporating the build out for the refrigerated space while the construction of the terminals is happening. So in the next couple of months, I'm going to look into that if that's a possibility. So really anything that alleviates the challenges of the donation. So making it as close as possible, as easy as possible. I think SFO covering the costs for the business tenant is huge. We were fortunate enough to receive grant funding from the San Francisco Department of the Environment to cover the cost of it, so the business tenants don't have to pay for the service. All they're required to do is to, take a bit of their time out of the day to drop off the food. And the kind of funny thing is that they're already taking time out of the day to take the food to the compost compactor. So really, we're just asking them to switch the end location and take it to the food donation hub instead of the, where the compactors and the dumpsters are. So, yeah, and I'll just leave it at that.
The behavior change part, making it as easy as possible for people is really important. We've seen that with our food donors. Whenever there is somebody who is like a clear champion at a location and can pass that information on to others and make it really clear, I think a lot of people get intimidated by food recovery and like concerned that it's going to be much more difficult than it actually is, because as you're saying, it's a pretty small behavior change. It's taking it to a different location. You would still be making that trip, but it's making that trip for something else. It looks like we have one last question that came in, and this will be our final one. It says, what outreach is currently being done by CalRecycle to educate and encourage donors to establish edible food recovery agreements? On the food recovery level, we are finding much of the work is being taken on by food recovery organizations like food banks in order to preserve existing donation relationships.
So I had briefly touched on that SB 1383 does have education and outreach requirements. Again, this is at the jurisdictional level. So jurisdictions do need to be reaching out to their generators and informing them of the requirements. So not only to encourage establishing those agreements, but generators are required to establish a contract or written agreement with a food recovery organization or service. We also provide outreach in forms of webinars such as this, meet with stakeholder groups, but that direct outreach is an actual requirement of the 1383 regulations.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And Danielle probably can't say this, but I can, is that each jurisdiction is kind of up to their own devices. So how seriously they're taking this legislation, how quickly they're implementing it has an effect on what you're seeing in your own county and whether or not you're seeing outreach and education happening at this moment. So I think it's also, CalRecycle has put this into place, but it's really up to those jurisdictions to carry it out. And I think it's really important to be involved in your local politics and make sure that they see that constituents are watching, and this is important that this legislation is carried out in the way that it's meant to be, because I think, ultimately it is up to those jurisdictions to be doing the education piece. And I know the past few years have been really difficult with COVID. Everyone has had a lot on their plates to deal with, and there have been other things that have taken priority. But with COVID, also food insecurity has risen. And so it's important to also put time and effort into this legislation that's going to hopefully help out with that. Well, with that, I'm just put up our final poll if you'd like to take it, and you can reach out to our partnerships team if you're interested in learning more about working with Replate, and we'll have our next webinar on August 18th, which will be navigating SB 1383 as a nonprofit. Thank you to all of our lovely panelists. I really appreciate you all joining us. And yeah, we'll be back in August with a different group of panelists to talk to you a bit more about this.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Everyone, bye, take care.